Hi there, welcome to our inaugural podcast. My name is Matt Day. I'm joined by Katie Socker from Twigs, and today we're going to talk about behavioural economics and specifically its relevance to the marketing community. So, hi Katie.
Hello Matt.
So do you want to start by just telling us a bit about what is behavioural economics or behavioural science?
So to start telling about behavioural economics, it's probably easiest to go back a step and explain how it relates to economics. So economics, in its simplest format, is how people trade and interact with each other, how they make decisions, how they process information. A few years ago, a number of psychologists started looking at these economic models that had been produced, which were very simple and elegant and were designed to sort of portray the world very simply, and realised that the fundamental flaw with them was that they weren't taking into account the fact that as humans we're not always rational. So often we are driven by unconscious influences that we're not aware of, and that often we will act in irrational ways but in a predictable way. So in a certain context we will act in a certain way. So they sort of looked at and have done a number of experiments focusing on what people actually do versus what we think we do, which is actually quite different. And really there's three sort of areas that leads you to in terms of sort of outtakes. The first one is a focus on the contexts of that people are acting in. So the same person might act in very different ways in different environments. And as marketeers, we often intuitively know that. So we don't talk about, somebody being a female 35 and always acting the same way. That person might be quite different when they're a mum at home or a wife or out with their friends or in the workplace. But sometimes we lose that and we forget the importance of context as to how people interact. The second sort of area of interest is that because as humans, there is a huge amount of information that we're bombarded with every day and a huge number of choices, we can't physically process all the information. We're not computers, so we have shortcuts. So in the same way that if you see somebody throw a ball, you don't stop and calculate the curve that it's going to make, you just intuitively go for it. We've developed these mental shortcuts, which are called heuristics or biases. And they are the way that people will kind of systematically make shortcuts in how they process information to kind of get to results. And then I guess the third one, for us as marketers, it's really important to think about is the implications of the environment being important for you and making these shortcuts is that the way a choice is laid out massively determines how you are then influenced to select something or make an informed choice. And
So give an example then how a choice is laid out. What does that mean to the layman?
Well, if you think about a supermarket shelf, how you lay a supermarket shelf out will determine how people are reacting to things. So if I see an expensive product sat next to very similar products that look the same, I will not think that is good value. Whereas if I see that same product against much more expensive products, suddenly that becomes a good value option.
Okay.
So we do
like the comparison set.
In comparison set, exactly. So one of the key things about the context is that people aren't making a decision in isolation. You're always comparing things to things. You're anchoring off your kind of reference points and making those decisions. It might equally be the way that things are laid out in terms of the journey of your eye along a shelf. So, there's different studies that have been done looking at how people make choices amongst information when it's laid out horizontally versus vertically, or how, when you draw attention to a certain item, it draws your eye to it and you might take it. So that's a very literal choice set, but it might equally as marketers be how you're processing information about who to target a campaign to, or what you do in terms of your planning process, or the choices you make around innovation. So everything is a choice set, and sort of viewing it in that way is quite helpful. And then I think one of the other things that's really kind of important to say is that these forces are happening whether you choose to engage with them or not. So as marketers, intuitively, we engage a lot of the time with these influences, but often there's more that we could be doing to kind of consciously think about how we use those forces.
Yeah.
So
to talk a bit more, because it's this is fascinating stuff. I'm just wondering whether it's something that marketers, well, in your experience, are they familiar with this? Are people using it? Are people getting kind of commercial results from employing some of these these processes and approaches?
Yes, I mean, I think sort of most marketeers will be using this without realising it, because if they're sort of wanting to connect with people and get people to pick their products up. But there are some people and some sectors, I'd say, who are more forward-facing in terms of using this deliberately. So if you think about online retailers, they will use a lot of these sort of shortcuts to help get people to make choices. So, for example, generally we like to conserve energy when we make choices, which leads to the power of defaults. So when you're doing your online shop and you see, here are your favourites, here what you bought last week, don't have to think about it. I know if I want a particular something from that category, I'm just going to go to that. Scarcity bias, so we're drawn to things which are more rare. So just a sort of an evolutionary thing that, if something is disappearing, it has a value to you. So if you go on travel agency websites, for example, they'll talk about only so many left. And it's not if you hear people from that industry talk, it's not designed to sort of scare you or make you hurry up. It's to give you the information that it's of value to other people. The other thing that people will do is, we often forget sort of the importance of social acceptability for our choices. So particularly as marketers, when you're asking people something in research, people won't tend to tell you, well, I was driven to do it because I saw everybody around me doing it. That doesn't feel like a very rational thing to do. We don't like to sort of admit that to ourselves. But, people have used that all the time. So, for example, alcohol ads where they show people being socially accepted, happy smiling faces. There's a lot of work that shows the importance of personal connections, and seeing people rather than seeing messages can be hugely important. And yet, at a fundamental level, something like a grip and grin, where somebody, sort of a celebrity's holding a bottle of product, is using something like the messenger effect, which is where we tuned in more to the person who's delivering the message than the message itself.
Yeah.
So these things are kind of rippled throughout marketing. It's just there are some people who are using it more consciously than others at the moment.
Okay, I've never heard grip and grin. I'm learning tons of stuff, and that's one of the things I'm learning. Imagine that on the brief to an ad agency.
Yeah, no, maybe not.
So, one of the things that I did recently was chatted to the communications director for a well-known brand with a very kind of strong sort of ethical kind of stance. And in the course of the conversation, we were talking, and he said that one of the things that he felt was that consumers nowadays, as opposed to say even 15 or 20 years ago, kind of they get marketing. The word he uses was they decode marketing. So we were talking about the need to be authentic. And he was saying, look, you can't be anything but authentic because consumers get it now. Like, they know how to play the game. Do consumers get behavioural economics, do you think? Maybe not in kind of academic terms, but do you think that they know how their brains are influenced and how marketers exploit that?
No, and I think that even as marketeers, sometimes we don't realise how our own brains are influenced by these forces. So sometimes we're quite good at thinking, well, consumers aren't, will be driven by emotion, and that's great. But then we forget, as marketers, we're also driven by emotion when we're making our choices, even in the business environment. So no, I think it's very much an embryonic science. It's relatively new, that it's been sort of touted as a holistic discipline, and it's very much in development. What I would say, though, is I think sort of your question starts to bring us on to sort of some of the ethical concerns that get raised around using these sorts of approaches effectively to sell products.
Yeah.
And I think there's two main answers to that. The first one is that you're doing it anyway. You're using these forces as a marketeer, so using them in a more efficient way just makes better sense. The second one is really that the whole point around things like nudges, which are ways where you put choices to people, so in a way that you encourage them to make a choice that's good for them, is that it is still about maintaining that person's choice. So it's not about removing choice or making it so that it's a slanted choice. It's about helping them make a choice with the information.
And I guess at the end of the day, as with anything, if over a sustained period you do something in a sneaky or an underhand way, then you basically get found out. So
Yeah.
I guess that's the thing that must drive us to use this sort of understanding responsibly. So can you give us some practical examples? Let's say I'm a product manager or a marketing manager, and I work in a firm that sells products through sort of grocery retailers. What are the sorts of things that I should be thinking about that I can improve my effectiveness either as a marketeer or the performance of my product? What sorts of things should I be thinking about practically?
So if you start almost from, I guess, the shelf back, there's a huge amount around that physical space and understanding how that choice and presentation goes to consumers. Almost if you think, I was going to say 4 Ps, but then it became 7 Ps, didn't it? And 8 Ps, and however many Ps there are now. Yeah. But pretty much any one of those, you could say that there is behavioural economics influence on it. So pricing, obviously, is a huge part of what marketeers commercially will be thinking about. And, thinking savvily about choosing your price points, your promotional strategy, what that actually tells people. And often what people will take out of things aren't necessarily what we always intend. So we might intend, for example, an example might be a classically beautifully lined up shelf, which gets the area rep kind of brownie points and looks beautiful, might actually be signalling to people that product isn't being shopped by other people and therefore is less desirous of than something else. So it's these sorts of little things where, you can sort of just question what actually is it what's the impact it's having versus what I as a marketeer want it to have. And then if you kind of move further back through the chain, obviously, thinking about the comms that you develop and the media strategy. So a lot of media agencies now are sort of driving on the front foot with this, thinking about the different environments that people are in when they receive your message. So emotionally, if somebody's in a very happy place, they're going to be more receptive to your message than they might be in other environments. And they might receive the same message in very different ways in different environments. So there's been a bit of a trend sometimes to think about, it's the consistency of message and always saying exactly the same thing. That might not always be the case. It might be worth thinking about different messages in different places to have different impacts.
Because I guess practically people have got hugely different kind of attention spans, and they're exposed to marketing messages for vastly different amounts of time depending on the context. Social media feeds versus TV versus this sort of thing, which is perhaps a bit more considered.
Yes. And then if you kind of go even further back, thinking about the kind of the information that you're using, just sort of questioning sort of some of the interpretations of data versus what it actually says. So we obviously all interpret data, and that's kind of where the value add is. But often observational data can have sometimes greater value than reported data. So sometimes asking consumers why they do things doesn't necessarily always get you to a great answer. So thinking about sort of again how you're bringing that sort of behavioural challenge, I guess, into kind of early stages is kind of useful.
Yeah, I remember doing something years ago with a food company, and the difference between what people would say their eating habits were, in a kind of qual group, which is at the end of the day what a lot of decisions are made on, is these fairly standardised kind of qual groups with a sort of formulaic way of running them. But you do the same exercise, you just sit in the corner of somebody's kitchen and you physically observe, say, the number of times that they open the fridge door, the number of, particularly with things like snacking behaviour. We simply can't articulate our own behaviour because we don't know what it is. But people, open fridge doors far more often, they snack far more often than they would probably report in that situation, I guess.
Absolutely, and it's sort of just done a master's in behavioural science. We should probably say that. I'm not sort of sitting here sort of sprouting it off. And for my dissertation, I actually did an experiment looking at healthier food choices and what people ate versus what they said they did. And there was no correlation whatsoever. So the amount they physically ate in this experiment had no correlation with how important healthy eating was to them, what they thought that they were going to eat. There was no correlation whatsoever.
Wow. And so what are people's kind of perceptions of behavioural economics? If you talk to marketers, do they know about it?
So my impression at the moment is there's maybe a couple of camps. There's some camps who, I think most people have heard of it, but are maybe it's less top of their priority at the moment, and potentially just don't see the value because there aren't, by definition, you shouldn't, as being on the receiving end of it, feel like you're being bombarded with behavioural economics.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily always know what part it's played in the process. And then I think there's another group who are really on the front foot, are interested by it. There's a lot of popular books out there that people probably have on their bedside tables, but probably are still working through how they can really use it for their organisation. And then on the sort of the front foot, you have those sort of much smaller group, often in agencies, sort of more in planning, facilities, disciplines, who are really embracing it and trying to find new ways of developing new research models, developing new ways of planning, sort of putting this approach at the heart of it.
And do you have any advice for let's say there's a marketer sat within an organisation going, actually this sounds intuitively very sensible, and I'd like to think about ways that I can take these areas of context, the biases, and the layout of choices and so on, and apply those within my role. But I've got to persuade other people, like my boss or the chief exec, that this is the right way to go. Have you got any advice for those types of people? I mean, are there examples that they can draw on? Can they even prove some sort of monetary return on taking more of a behavioural approach?
So I think I'm a bit of a proponent of ask forgiveness, not permission, which in this sort of space, because I
wild
think
child level in our midst here.
But I think it's very difficult to. Sometimes it can just sound counterintuitive, and I think there are some people that are very happy with that, and some people aren't. And this is a bit of a generalisation, but I think sometimes the higher up you get in an organisation, the more difficult it might be for you to embrace these sort of slightly more counterintuitive approaches.
Yeah.
But I would say that, if you're dealing with good planners and good agency folk, have discussions with them, and if they haven't got that skill set in their own agency, and there's a slight risk at the moment that everybody suddenly starts calling themselves behavioural experts, because we're all marketers and we think about behaviour. If they can't sort of demonstrate a bit of the rigour and sort of bringing that academic theory into practical ways you can use it, then there are other sort of more expert agencies out there. But I would almost build it into your proposal rather than call it out as I'm going to start doing things differently and start using behavioural science. Obviously, that will hugely depend on the individuals involved, but one of the challenges, there are many challenges for behavioural science, is that there is no one simple overriding principle that people can attach themselves to. And the higher up you go, the more generally like generalities, you like kind of principles that can be applied everywhere. So behavioural science, the richness of it is that it doesn't try and simplify people's behaviour to be only one thing. It says you need to embrace all the drivers of people's influence, but that can in the same make it quite challenging to sell in, because you're not selling in a simple, packed answer. Yeah.
And does behavioural science, I guess, help us to understand what we're seeing in simplistic terms? Is it, okay, there's this behaviour going on, it might be happening because of X, Y, Z biases or context or whatever?
It can help you do that. It might be the X, Y, and Z, but it's you have to probably invest quite a lot of time, money, and resource that realistically most companies don't have to do very robust scientific studies to really isolate things. So I think it's very good at focusing on results and making sure people test things, and it can give you hypotheses, and it can give you likely reasons why that might be, but it doesn't necessarily say definitively this is what happened, and therefore if you transfer that definitive approach to other places it will work.
Yeah, I see. And can you think of any I guess quick wins? So if I'm listening to this and think, okay, I quite like the sound of this, is there 2 or 3 things I can do tomorrow or next week in my role, which may be not revolutionary, may not change the world or the fortunes of the business, but just perhaps 2 or 3 things that people can go away and implement in a pretty short time scale.
So, I guess the first thing would be anybody who's got pen portraits of their consumers sitting on their laptop or their wall, would be to go back to it and think around a couple of points, which would be, we all as humans have a tendency to make narratives up and to see and to sort of fit what we believe somebody should be to what they are. So, if it's a representation of somebody, to go back and challenge that and to think around what is the context that people are actually engaging with my brand and my product in, and is that context showing up in how I'm thinking about the consumer? So almost to think about not just target consumers but target contexts. So that would be the first very kind of easy sort of win.
And I think that's a really interesting one, because a sort of pet hate of mine is I think we all do it because marketing is our world. We perhaps sometimes overestimate the role that our product or service plays in a consumer's life. So I love the point you make about context, because too often we'll kind of go, yeah, this is a hugely considered decision, and we talk about loyal consumers like they would never buy another brand, which of course, and that thinking is being really challenged much more recently with a lot more evidence-based marketing thinking. But I love that, the idea that you think about context, not just person. That's really valuable.
Well, let's face it, as marketers, we probably spend more time over our morning coffee talking and thinking about our brands than most consumers will do in a lifetime.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, true.
So, yes, that's really important. And then I would say other things would be around thinking around pricing, and there are just some very available information out there around how pricing can be thinking about what you're anchoring off, what is your true competitive set in terms of when people are engaging with you. So again, we have a tendency with the best one in the world to get sort of stuck in our little product categories. Yeah. That might not be the context and the kind of competitive set that people are anchoring off and making that choice about. And then I guess the final point would be, just as influencers in businesses ourselves, there are a few kind of quick things that you can probably do to sort of help drive engagement. So one of the big things is that we all are much more ego-driven than we like to admit. So
surely not.
I know,
it's amazing, everybody apart from us, right?
Absolutely. So one of the sort of the kind of the things about that, and marketers do this anyway, but it's something called the IKEA effect, which is that we care about furniture that we've helped create and build ourselves way more than we do about a similar product that we've just bought. And actually, as marketers, we do that all the time. So you'll invite people to a brainstorming, won't you, so that they can be part of the process.
Yeah.
But I think kind of thinking again about how you use that within the process and how you help kind of people make decisions is sort of a thought.
Maybe there's an alternative to the IKEA effect, which is we care about it because we don't want to go through the process again for a very long time. That's fantastic, and great example of some quick wins that people can take away. If people are interested in this area, are there any places that they can go to talk to people? Obviously, your good self. Any books that they should be reading? How do people go about finding out more?
Well, I think it's an area where there is a lot of academic and frankly quite dry material out there. So I would say kind of my top recommendation at the moment is a book called The Choice Factory by Richard Shotton, who's been out, I think it's only been out for like a couple of months. And what he has done is taken 25 of the most appropriate heuristics and biases that affect marketers and advertisers, and in very short sort of chunks of chapters talks about them and gives examples and brings them to life. So he's showing a little bit of the theory and a little bit of kind of the practical examples. Yeah. So that's kind of a great reading material. Then I think if people are more interested in a purist approach, there's a book called The Undoing Project by a guy called Michael Lewis. Now, he was the author who wrote the books behind Moneyball and The Big Short, which have been two of, I guess, kind of the Hollywood ways that behavioural economics has come onto the radar. So this book will absolutely be made into a film, but that talks around two of the founding fathers of behavioural economics, and it gives, in the context of their lives, how they came up with some of the key findings. So it's an easy read. It's definitely not as dense or as hard going as things like Thinking Fast and Slow, which can feel quite difficult to get you through. Yeah. So that would be kind of a more purist point of view.
And certainly, as you say, I mean, I've read a couple of books in this area, but they've been quite sort of almost like pop psychology, quite for quite a general audience, which is great and very interesting. But particularly good that you've mentioned the Choice Factory, which is like tailored for marketeers. And I guess sometimes it's about bridging between something that's quite interesting and something that helps us to be more effective in our workplace. So that's a particularly interesting recommendation.
Yeah. Well, I think it's that sort of marketing and behavioural scientists tend to speak two very different languages. So people that find that common ground are relatively rare on the ground. And Richard, I think, has done a really great job at bringing those two together.
So one last question, which is perhaps, and you touched on it just now, which is around people speaking different languages. But what are the kind of the pitfalls, if you like, in applying behavioural economics? I mean, do people get it wrong? How do people get it wrong, and what should we be kind of trying to avoid?
So people can get it wrong without realising it. So as I say, because these sort of drivers and influences are happening anyway. There are sort of examples where you can look at marketing campaigns, or I saw one the other week for kind of a news campaign to try and get more organ donors, and actually they got it completely wrong. The message they gave across was actually, there's a reason why in your community nobody's doing this, rather than actually kind of engaging people to try and get involved. And another great example was, The Guardian used to have something on its website that would say, more people are reading us than ever before, but less people are giving us money. Now, what do you take out of that? You take out of the fact of it that, yes, that's true, that is their problem, but most people don't give them money, so why should I be the person that gives them money? Yeah. So you can get it wrong quite easily without sort of thinking about it, and that's where I think having somebody who can bring in that specialism is useful. Yeah. I think the other way you can get it wrong is by just jumping on some of these principles, getting very excited about them, and then forgetting the importance of context. So again, almost turning out these very context-specific approaches and then trying to roll them out everywhere. Yeah. And then I guess the third way that I think academics would probably feel a little bit frustrated with marketeers is, we're not necessarily always testing things. We have a tendency to kind of go, I like that idea, let's roll with it, and if it works, it works, rather than perhaps putting more attention into kind of proofing and testing some of the principles behind it.
And I guess that speaks to the point that you made earlier, which is that as marketeers, we're not immune to these influences ourselves. We have to, perhaps that's the first step at looking at what's influencing us in order that we can make better decisions before we even start applying it to the consumer or the customer.
Yes, and it's very hard to spot your own biases by definition. So that's where there's a real opportunity. It's almost sort of like you kind of have to be a bit of a buddy for somebody to sort of say, maybe the reason you're so attached to that idea is because you will help build it, or maybe the reason is we think we have to keep working on this project is something called the sunk cost fallacy. We've invested so much in it, we feel we can't stop. Yeah. So there are lots of these sort of forces at play, sort of helping just kind of gently question, I guess, kind of what people's drivers are behind those things can be useful.
That's such a true point, because I think one of the most I do work with companies looking at basically strategic choices, and it's easy to decide what you're going to do, but it is so difficult to decide what you're not going to do, and particularly if, as you say, there's been some time or effort or money sunk into a project, deciding to can that project is a far more difficult decision to make. So that certainly strikes a chord. Yeah.
But actually, I think so that there's such a power to having that focus. So one of the things about our brains is that if you have too many ideas, too many projects, too many things happening, it's a myth that we multitask. What we do is do sequentially one thing and then move to another, and each time we lose energy and attention because of it. Is that when you have sort of, you don't make choices as to what you're going to do, by definition you sort of spread yourselves too thinly, and it can affect your kind of engagement with them. There's sort of a lot of theory behind that I won't go into, but it can have a negative effect sometimes, this world that we're living in, where we say, well, we're not sure what we're going to do, we're not sure what's going to work, so let's just try everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we could talk all day. It's such a fascinating area, and there's so much to it when you dig beneath the surface. But thank you ever so much for coming to us and talking about some of the key points around behavioural economics, and how, of course, as marketeers we can put this into practice, not just for our brands and for our customers, but in terms of our own the way we operate within our own businesses. So thanks ever so much for your time. It's been great talking to you, and we will talk to you again very soon.
Thank you, Matt. My pleasure.